In 1499, a Portuguese fleet returned to Europe carrying something that would change the world forever. They had not found gold, they had not found silver, they had found pepper. And the men who controlled that pepper would become the wealthiest human beings on Earth. But the story of how they found it is not a story of exploration. It is a story of obsession, violence, and genocide. Thousands of sailors died at sea just to reach it. Entire civilizations were destroyed to control it. Wars were fought across 3 continents for the right to sell it. And at the center of all of it was a tiny wrinkled black seed, no bigger than a pea. A seed that today sits forgotten in a shaker on your kitchen table, worth almost nothing. But for over 1,000 years, pepper was worth more than gold. And the men who wanted it were willing to do anything to get it. This is the forbidden truth of pepper. Pepper does not come from Europe. It does not come from the Middle East. It comes from a narrow strip of tropical coastline in southwestern India, a region called Malabar, in what is now the state of Kerala. Here, in dense tropical forests climbing the Western Ghats Mountains, a climbing vine called Piper nigrum grows in conditions that exist almost nowhere else on Earth. It needs intense heat, heavy monsoon rainfall, high humidity, and specific soil conditions found only in this corner of the subcontinent. The vine produces small round berries in dense clusters called spikes. Harvested unripe and dried in the sun, those berries shrink and wrinkle into the small black spheres that became the most valuable commodity in the ancient world. The people of Malabar had been cultivating this vine for at least 4,000 years before any European ever tasted pepper. They knew exactly what they had. And for centuries, they controlled it absolutely. The first written record of black pepper appears in ancient Sanskrit texts dating back to around 1000 BC. Indian physicians described it as a medicine, a preservative, and a sacred offering to the gods. It was used to treat everything from digestive problems to snake bites. It was burned in religious ceremonies. It was mixed into pastes applied to wounds to prevent infection. The active compound in black pepper, piperine, genuinely does have antibacterial properties. The ancient healers of India did not know the chemistry, but they had discovered the effect through thousands of years of observation. Pepper was not just a spice in ancient India. It was a pharmacy, a currency, and a connection to the divine. And slowly, through the web of ancient trade routes that crossed the Indian Ocean, word of this miraculous seed began to spread westward. By 400 BC, black pepper had reached the Persian Empire. Persian traders who sailed the Arabian Sea brought it back to the markets of Persepolis in Babylon, where it commanded extraordinary prices. A small pouch of pepper could buy a horse. A larger quantity could buy land. The wealthy of the ancient world paid fortunes for it, not just because it tasted good, but because in a world without refrigeration, pepper was power. It masked the taste and smell of meat that had begun to turn. It extended the usable life of food by days, sometimes weeks. In a world where famine was always one bad harvest away, anything that made food last longer was worth any price. By the time Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 330 BC, pepper had already been flowing westward for over a century. Alexander's armies encountered it in the markets of every city they conquered. Greek physicians began writing about it. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, mentioned pepper in his medical texts. But it was Rome that would become truly obsessed. Rome imported pepper in quantities that staggered the ancient world. Roman recipes called for it in almost every dish, not as a subtle accent, but as a primary ingredient used in massive amounts. The Romans' hunger for pepper was so intense that it created one of the first international trade deficits in recorded history. Gold and silver flowed out of the Roman Empire and into India in exchange for pepper. Roman economists and senators warned that the empire was being drained of its wealth by luxury imports. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, was furious about it. He calculated that Rome was spending the equivalent of hundreds of millions of sesterces every year importing pepper and other Eastern spices. He called it a ruinous addiction. He was right. But nobody listened. Because the people who could afford pepper were the same people who ran the Senate. And they were not going to give up their pepper. The trade route that carried pepper from India to Rome was one of the most complex logistical systems in the ancient world. Indian merchants sailed from the Malabar coast across the Arabian Sea to ports in Arabia or the Persian Gulf. There, Arab traders took over, carrying the pepper overland across the desert in camel caravans to ports on the Mediterranean. From there, Roman ships carried it to Alexandria, and then overland to Rome. At every step of this journey, someone took a cut. By the time pepper reached a Roman kitchen, its price had been marked up by a factor of 10, sometimes 20. And the Arab traders in the middle were very careful to ensure that nobody in the West found out where pepper actually came from. They told elaborate stories about pepper growing in snake-infested forests guarded by monsters. They said harvesting it required burning the forests first to drive the snakes away, which was why pepper was black. None of this was true, but it worked. For centuries, Europeans believed these stories, and the Arab traders who told them became fabulously wealthy, controlling the flow of information along with the flow of pepper. Then Rome fell, and everything got worse. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, the sophisticated trade networks that had kept pepper flowing into Europe began to fracture. The roads became dangerous. The ports became contested. The merchants who had operated under Roman protection found themselves exposed to raiders, local warlords, and the chaos of a continent reorganizing itself from the ruins of empire. Pepper became scarcer, and scarcity made it more valuable than ever. In medieval Europe, pepper became a form of currency, not metaphorically, literally. Landlords accepted pepper as payment for rent. Taxes were calculated in peppercorns. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, their leader Alaric demanded a ransom that included 3,000 pounds of pepper, along with gold, silver, and silk. He valued pepper on the same level as precious metals. Dowries were paid in pepper. Debts were settled in pepper. The phrase peppercorn rent, still used in English legal language today to mean a token payment, comes directly from this era, when a handful of pepper was considered a legitimate and valuable form of payment. Merchants who dealt in pepper in medieval Europe were among the richest men on the continent. The great trading cities of Venice and Genoa built their entire economies around controlling the flow of Eastern spices and pepper. Above all, Venetian traders established contacts with Arab merchants in Alexandria and Constantinople. They paid enormous sums to secure exclusive access to the spice supply, and then they marked the prices up even further for the rest of Europe. Venice became arguably the wealthiest city in the medieval world on the back of pepper. The Venetian merchant class built palaces, funded art, commissioned cathedrals. The wealth that built Renaissance Italy flowed, in significant part, from a tiny black seed grown on the other side of the world. But Venice's control over the pepper trade depended entirely on their Arab intermediaries, and those intermediaries depended on the overland routes staying open. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople. The Ottomans now controlled the land routes between east and west. They taxed every caravan that passed through. They could, and did, cut off access entirely when it suited them politically. The price of pepper in Western Europe spiked to levels that made it genuinely unaffordable for most people. The kings and merchants of Western Europe faced a stark choice: find a new route to the source of pepper, or accept Ottoman control of the spice trade forever. They chose to find a new route, and that decision would change the entire world. The story that is usually told about the age of exploration is one of curiosity, bravery, and the human desire to understand the world. That story is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. The age of exploration was driven primarily by one thing: pepper. Portugal, a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe with a long Atlantic coastline, began sending ships south along the African coast in the early 1400s. The goal was not scientific. The goal was to find a sea route around Africa and into the Indian Ocean, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled land routes entirely, to reach the pepper at its source, to cut out the Arab and Venetian middlemen, and to control the entire trade themselves. It took decades. The Portuguese crept down the African coast year by year, decade by decade. They mapped coastlines nobody in Europe had seen. They lost ships to storms they had never encountered. They died of diseases their bodies had no defense against. But they kept going, because the prize at the end was worth any cost. In 1488, a Portuguese explorer named Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, becoming the first European to enter the Indian Ocean from the Atlantic. He had proven the route was possible. 10 years later, in 1497, a fleet of 4 ships commanded by an anonymous Portuguese captain left Lisbon. They sailed south along the African coast, rounded the Cape, and turned north into the Indian Ocean. In May 1498, after 10 months at sea and the deaths of dozens of sailors from scurvy and disease, they arrived at Calicut on the Malabar coast of India. They had found the source of pepper. The local ruler, the Zamorin of Calicut, received them politely but was unimpressed. The Portuguese had brought gifts: cloth, coral, sugar, oil, that the Indians found insultingly cheap. The Arab traders already established in Calicut were alarmed. They understood immediately what the Portuguese arrival meant. Their monopoly on the trade route was under threat. They warned the Zamorin that the Portuguese were dangerous. The Portuguese left with a small cargo of pepper and other spices, but they had proven something far more valuable than what they carried home. They had proven the route worked, and what came next was not trade. It was war. When the Portuguese returned to India in 1500, they came with more ships and guns, lots of guns. The Portuguese were not interested in negotiating for pepper. They were interested in controlling it, completely, absolutely, by force if necessary. And force was their first choice. The Portuguese strategy in the Indian Ocean was unlike anything the region had seen. They attacked Arab trading ships without warning or declaration of war. They burned coastal towns that refused to trade exclusively with them. They executed merchants who tried to sell pepper to anyone else. They established fortified trading posts called feitorias at key points along the Indian Ocean trade routes, garrisoned with soldiers and armed with cannon. In 1502, the Portuguese fleet encountered an Arab merchant vessel called the Miri returning from Mecca. The ship was carrying 400 Muslim pilgrims, men, women, and children, returning from the Hajj. The Portuguese captured the ship, locked the passengers below decks, and set it on fire. They stood on their own decks and watched it burn. Every person aboard died. The Portuguese commander who ordered this massacre later received a commendation from the King of Portugal. In 1510, the Portuguese captured the city of Goa on the Indian coast. After a brutal assault, they massacred the Muslim population of the city, men, women, and children, over several days. Goa became the headquarters of Portugal's Eastern Empire. From Goa, Portuguese forces extended their control across the Indian Ocean. They attacked and captured Malacca in 1511, the great trading city that controlled the flow of spices from Southeast Asia. They established a presence in the Spice Islands, the Maluku Islands of modern Indonesia, the only place on Earth where nutmeg and cloves grew. By the 1520s, Portugal had established the first global trading empire in history. Their ships sailed routes connecting Lisbon to Brazil, West Africa, East Africa, India, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan. And pepper, along with other spices, flowed from the Malabar coast through Portuguese-controlled ports back to Lisbon, where it was sold to the rest of Europe at enormous profit. The Arab merchants who had controlled the trade for centuries were ruined. The Venetians, cut off from their supply, watched their wealth evaporate. Tiny Portugal, a kingdom of fewer than 2 million people, had seized control of trade routes spanning half the globe, all for pepper. Portugal's empire was built on violence, but what replaced it was worse. By the late 1500s, Portugal was exhausted. A series of disasters, the destruction of their fleet by England in 1588, a catastrophic war with Spain, the loss of key trading posts had weakened their grip on the spice trade. Into that vacuum came the Dutch. The Dutch Republic in the early 1600s was the most sophisticated financial and commercial power in the world. They had invented the modern stock market. They had created the first publicly traded company in history, the Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials as the VOC. The VOC was not a company in any modern sense of the word. It had its own army, its own navy, its own courts, its own prisons. It had the legal authority to wage war, sign treaties, and execute people. It was a corporation with the powers of a state. And it used those powers with a ruthlessness that shocked even the violent standards of the age. The VOC's goal in the Spice Islands was total monopoly, not just control of trade, total, absolute, violent control of production. On the Banda Islands, a tiny cluster of islands in the Maluku archipelago that were the world's only source of nutmeg, the VOC carried out what historians now describe as one of the earliest documented cases of genocide in the colonial era. The Bandanese people had traded nutmeg with Arab, Javanese, and Chinese merchants for centuries. They were not interested in giving the VOC exclusive control, so the VOC destroyed them. Between 1609 and 1621, VOC forces, including Japanese mercenaries hired specifically for their reputation for brutality, systematically killed, enslaved, or expelled the entire population of the Banda Islands. A population estimated at 15,000 people before Dutch contact had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 within a decade. The islands were then repopulated with Dutch colonists and enslaved people forced to grow nutmeg under conditions of absolute VOC control. For pepper, the VOC applied similar methods across the Malabar coast and the Indonesian archipelago. Local rulers who refused to sell pepper exclusively to the VOC found their ports blockaded, their fleets burned, and their cities bombarded. Those who complied were kept in power but reduced to dependence of the VOC, receiving fixed prices regardless of market conditions, forbidden to sell to any other buyer. The VOC controlled the price of pepper in Europe completely. They could, and did, destroy excess stocks of pepper to keep prices artificially high. In a world where millions of people were going hungry, the VOC burned or dumped pepper to protect its profit margins. The VOC operated this system for nearly 2 centuries. It became the most valuable company in history, worth, at its peak, more than $8 trillion in modern terms, all of it built on the back of a tiny black seed, and the suffering of everyone who stood between that seed and the European market. By the late 1700s, the VOC was dying. Corruption had hollowed it out from within. The British East India Company had been steadily encroaching on its territories. New sources of pepper were being developed in other regions, Sumatra, Brazil, Vietnam, that the VOC could not monopolize as effectively as the Banda Islands. In 1799, the VOC was officially dissolved. Its territories were taken over by the Dutch government, and in the following century, the global pepper trade transformed from a monopoly system into a competitive market. The price of pepper collapsed, not slowly, catastrophically. By the 1800s, pepper was affordable to ordinary people across Europe for the first time in history. The trade that had driven exploration, empire, genocide, and 2 centuries of corporate tyranny became ordinary commerce, a commodity. Today, the world produces over 500,000 metric tons of pepper every year. Vietnam alone, a country that had no significant pepper industry until the 20th century, now produces more than a third of the world's supply. The price of a kilogram of black pepper is lower in real terms than at almost any point in the last 2,000 years. The spice that once commanded the same price as gold now sits on the bottom shelf of every grocery store, bought without a second thought. But the world that pepper made is still the world we live in. The trade routes that European powers established to reach it became the arteries of global commerce. The military technologies they developed to control it became the foundation of colonial power. The financial instruments the Dutch invented to fund the VOC, stocks, shares, bonds, limited liability, became the foundation of modern capitalism. The genocide carried out to the Banda Islands to secure nutmeg, a spice as unimportant as pepper is today, became a template for colonial violence that would be repeated across the Americas, Africa, and Asia for the next 3 centuries. And the thousands of Indian merchants, Arab traders, Bandanese farmers, and enslaved workers who died so that wealthy Europeans could season their food. Their names were never written down. Not bad for a tiny wrinkled seed. A seed so ordinary that you probably knocked the shaker over reaching for something else last night without noticing. Black pepper was the first global commodity, the first product that the entire connected world went to war over. The first thing that made men sail off the edge of their known world in ships they knew might kill them. It built Venice. It funded Portugal's empire. It created the Dutch East India Company, the most powerful corporation in the history of capitalism. It drove Europeans into the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, and eventually around the entire globe. And in doing so, it connected the world in ways that are still visible today. In trade routes, in financial systems, in borders drawn by colonial powers, and in the memory of peoples who were destroyed so that their land could grow a spice that Europe could not live without. The forbidden truth of pepper is not that it was valuable. The forbidden truth is what was sacrificed to get it, and who did the sacrificing, and who paid the price. If this story changed how you see the world, subscribe to Dark Crop, because every week, we pull back the curtain on the foods and commodities that built civilization, the stories behind what you eat, the ones they never told you.